The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1882, turning the desert floor into a furnace that could kill a man in hours. Most folks knew better than to venture into Devil's Canyon alone, especially when the nearest water was a day's ride away. But desperation makes people do foolish things, and sometimes those foolish choices lead to miracles nobody could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman carrying new life in a land that seemed determined to take it away, and Jack Reynolds, a cowboy who learned that salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. What happened between them in those scorching days would challenge everything they thought they knew about survival, trust, and the bonds that form when two souls refuse to give up on each other. It's a tale that reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we think we have nothing left to give, we might discover we're capable of more than we ever dreamed possible. The Arizona Territory in 1882 was a place where fortunes were made and lost with the swing of a pickaxe. Copper Ridge had sprung up almost overnight when prospectors discovered veins of precious metal, threading through the rocky hills like golden promises. Men poured in from every corner of the country, their eyes bright with dreams of striking it rich. They built their town fast and rough, with wooden buildings that creaked in the desert wind and saloons that never seemed to close. But for every man who found his fortune, 10 others found only backbreaking work and broken dreams. The mines were dangerous, the work was brutal, and the desert showed no mercy to those who underestimated its power. Sarah Mitchell had never wanted to come to Copper Ridge. She was a city girl from St. Louis, accustomed to tree-lined streets and proper houses with real foundations. But when she married Thomas Mitchell 3 years ago, she followed him west because that's what wives did. Thomas had been convinced he could make their fortune in the copper mines, and Sarah had believed in his dreams because she loved him. Their little house on the edge of town wasn't much to look at, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen, but Sarah had made it home. She'd sewn curtains for the windows, planted a small garden that struggled against the harsh soil, and painted the wooden walls a cheerful yellow that reminded her of sunflowers. When she discovered she was carrying their first child, she'd started knitting tiny blankets and imagining the laughter that would soon fill their modest home. Thomas would come home each evening covered in dust and copper residue, his hands stained green from the metal, but his eyes still held hope. He would wash up in the basin by the back door, then sit at their small wooden table while Sarah served whatever she'd managed to prepare with their limited supplies. They would talk about the future, about the house they'd build when Thomas struck a rich vein, about the children they'd raise and the life they'd create together in this harsh but promising land. The other miners' wives had welcomed Sarah cautiously at first. Women were scarce in Copper Ridge, and those who did make the journey west were often harder than the desert stones, worn down by loss and disappointment. But Sarah's gentle nature and genuine kindness had gradually won them over. She helped tend the sick, shared her precious store of medicines when someone fell ill, and always had a pot of coffee brewing for anyone who needed a moment of comfort. Mary Lou, who ran the town's only respectable boarding house, had become something like an older sister to Sarah. She was a no-nonsense woman who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 3 sons in various frontier towns, and she took it upon herself to teach Sarah the hard lessons of desert survival. How to stretch supplies when the supply wagons were late, how to treat scorpion stings and snake bites, how to read the sky for signs of the flash floods that could turn dry creek beds into raging torrents in minutes. Doc Henderson, the town's only physician, was a gruff man who'd seen too much suffering to believe in easy answers, but even he had a soft spot for Sarah. When she'd first come to him to confirm her pregnancy, he'd delivered the news with unusual gentleness, then spent an hour explaining the challenges she'd face carrying a child in such a harsh environment. The nearest real hospital was in Tucson, over 100 miles away across dangerous desert, and women in Copper Ridge had to rely on Mary Lou's midwifery skills and whatever medical knowledge Doc Henderson had accumulated in 30 years of frontier medicine. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, she found herself increasingly grateful for the small community of women who looked after each other in this isolated place. They shared advice about dealing with morning sickness in the desert heat, traded remedies for swollen feet and aching backs, and quietly prepared for the possibility that not every birth would end in joy. The desert was an unforgiving place for mothers and babies, and everyone knew that bringing new life into the world here required courage that went beyond anything city folks could imagine. Thomas had been working the morning shift on a Tuesday. In late June, when the mine shaft collapsed, Sarah was in her garden, trying to coax her tomato plants to survive another scorching day, when she heard the distant rumble that every miner's wife feared. The sound rolled across the desert like thunder, but the sky was cloudless and bright. She dropped her watering can and ran toward town, her hand instinctively protecting her rounded belly as she hurried over the rough ground. The mine entrance was chaos when she arrived. Men covered in dust and panic emerged from the tunnels, shouting orders and calling for rope and timber. The shaft foreman was organizing rescue efforts, but Sarah could see the grim set of his jaw that told her everything she needed to know. When a support beam failed 6 levels down, it brought tons of rock and earth with it. The men trapped below that collapse had little chance of survival. Doc Henderson arrived with his medical bag, but there wasn't much he could do until the rescue teams could reach the trapped miners. Sarah stood with the other wives, holding hands and praying, as the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Some women wept openly, while others maintained the stoic silence that frontier life had taught them. Sarah found herself somewhere in between, her heart breaking but her mind refusing to accept that Thomas might not come home that evening. The first body they brought up was Pete Morrison, a young man barely 20 who'd been sending half his wages back to his mother in Kansas. Then came Old Henrik, a Swedish immigrant who'd worked mines all over the territory and should have known better than to trust a questionable support beam. One by one, they carried out the men who'd gone to work that morning with the same hopes and dreams they carried every day. Thomas was the last one they found. The rescue team had worked for 18 hours, digging through tons of debris by lamplight, before they reached the deepest part of the collapse. When they finally brought him up, Doc Henderson examined him by the light of lanterns while Sarah knelt beside his still form. There were no obvious injuries, no blood or broken bones, but the life had simply gone out of him somewhere in the darkness below. His heart, Doc Henderson said quietly, his weathered hand gentle on Sarah's shoulder. Sometimes when men are trapped like that, with the air running out and the weight of all that rock above them, their hearts just give up. He wouldn't have suffered long. Sarah sat beside Thomas's body as the other families claimed their dead and began the grim process of preparing for burial. The desert night was cold after the blazing heat of the day, and someone had draped a blanket around her shoulders, but she barely noticed. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly as if sensing that the world had suddenly become a much more dangerous place. Mary Lou found her there as dawn broke over the desert, still sitting beside the man she'd followed west to build a life with. The older woman didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside Sarah and waited. Finally, when the morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the air, Mary Lou spoke the words that would change everything. "You can't stay here, honey," she said gently. "Not with the baby coming and no man to provide for you. This place is too hard for a woman alone." Sarah knew Mary Lou was right, but the thought of leaving seemed impossible. This was where she'd been happy, where she'd dreamed of raising her children and growing old with Thomas. The little yellow house held all her memories, and walking away felt like abandoning the life they'd built together. But as the days passed and the reality of her situation became clear, Sarah realized she had no choice. The mine company offered a small settlement for Thomas's death, enough to cover the burial expenses and perhaps buy passage somewhere safer. The other miners were kind, pooling their resources to help her, but they had their own families to worry about and their own dangers to face every day they went into the tunnels. Sarah's sister Emma lived in California, married to a rancher near San Francisco, who'd built a successful operation raising cattle for the growing city's markets. Emma had written repeatedly over the years, begging Sarah to visit and bring Thomas, if he ever tired of mining. In her last letter, she'd extended a standing invitation for Sarah to come and help with the ranch while Emma's own children were small. It had seemed like a generous but unnecessary offer when Sarah had a husband and a home of her own. Now it looked like salvation. The journey from Copper Ridge to California meant crossing some of the most dangerous desert country in the territory. The established routes went north through safer terrain, but that would add weeks to the journey and cost money Sarah didn't have. The direct route west through Devil's Canyon was shorter but treacherous, with long stretches between water sources, and terrain that could turn deadly if a traveler made the wrong choice. Most folks said a pregnant woman would be crazy to attempt such a crossing, especially alone. But Sarah had learned something about herself in the days since Thomas died. Beneath the gentle city-bred exterior was a core of steel that she hadn't known existed. She'd survived the frontier for 3 years, adapted to its harsh demands, and brought new life into being despite the challenges. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off the stage in Copper Ridge, nervous and overwhelmed by the raw country stretching endlessly in every direction. Doc Henderson tried to talk her out of the journey, warning about the dangers of desert travel for someone in her condition. Mary Lou offered to let her stay at the boarding house until after the baby was born, working in exchange for room and board. Even the mine foreman suggested she might find work in town, perhaps teaching the few children whose families had established themselves permanently in Copper Ridge. But Sarah had made her decision. She would head west to California, to her sister and the promise of a safe place to raise her child. She spent her remaining money on supplies for the journey, water barrels for her wagon, preserved food, blankets, and the sturdy clothing she'd need for weeks of desert travel. She sold most of her furniture and household goods, keeping only the things that held the deepest memories of her life with Thomas. The morning she prepared to leave Copper Ridge, half the town came to see her off. The women pressed small gifts into her hands, precious things they could barely spare: a jar of honey, a packet of herb tea, a tiny wooden rattle carved by one of the miners for his own child. The men checked her wagon wheels and harness, making sure everything was secure for the journey ahead. Doc Henderson pulled her aside for a final conversation, his gruff exterior softening as he looked at this brave woman who'd become like a daughter to him. "You're sure about this route?" he asked one more time. "It's not too late to take the northern path." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Might take longer, but it's safer for someone in your condition. Sarah shook her head, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I need to get to Emma before the baby comes. The northern route would take too long, and I don't have enough money for supplies for that kind of journey." Doc Henderson nodded reluctantly, then pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. "Medical supplies," he said gruffly. "Things you might need well, just keep them close." As Sarah climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, she looked back at the little yellow house that had been her home. Someone else would live there now, perhaps another young couple full of dreams and determination. She hoped they'd be luckier than she and Thomas had been. Mary Lou walked alongside the wagon as Sarah drove toward the edge of town, her weathered hand resting on the wooden side rail. "You remember what I taught you about reading the signs," she said firmly. "Water first, shelter second, and don't trust anyone you meet out there until they prove themselves worthy of it. Desert does strange things to people's minds. Sarah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the desert heat, but there was no turning back now. Somewhere ahead lay the promise of safety and family, but between here and there stretched 100 miles of unforgiving country that had claimed the lives of better prepared travelers than a pregnant woman with a wagon and 2 tired horses. As Copper Ridge disappeared behind her in the morning heat haze, Sarah Mitchell drove west into a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. The desert was beautiful in its own harsh way, painted in shades of red and gold and purple that changed with the light. But beauty in the desert was deceptive, hiding dangers that could kill the unwary or unprepared. She had no way of knowing that somewhere ahead, in a rocky arroyo still hours away, a cowboy named Jack Reynolds lay dying of thirst, his horse having thrown him and disappeared into the vast emptiness. She couldn't imagine that her act of mercy, in stopping to help a stranger, would change both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. All Sarah knew was that she was carrying new life toward an uncertain future, trusting in her own strength and the hope that somewhere beyond the burning horizon lay the chance for a fresh beginning. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as Sarah guided her horses along the narrow trail that wound through Devil's Canyon. 3 days had passed since she'd left the familiar streets of Copper Ridge, and already the civilized world felt like something from a dream. Out here, there were no wooden buildings or mining equipment, no sounds of human activity echoing off the canyon walls. There was only the endless expanse of desert, the relentless sun overhead, and the growing awareness that she was truly alone in a landscape that cared nothing for her hopes or fears. The trail she followed was little more than wheel ruts carved by previous travelers, marked occasionally by cairns of stacked stones that indicated water sources or safe camping spots. Sarah had studied the route carefully before leaving town, memorizing the landmarks that would guide her west toward California. But studying a map in the safety of her kitchen was vastly different from navigating the actual terrain, where every rock formation looked similar and the heat created mirages that made distant objects dance and shimmer like phantoms. Her horses, a matched pair of sturdy mares named Belle and Daisy, had served Thomas well during his time in Copper Ridge. They were desert animals, bred for endurance rather than speed, but even they showed signs of strain as the journey progressed. Sarah rationed their water carefully, allowing them to drink from her precious supply only at dawn and dusk when the heat was less intense. She'd learned from the miners that horses could survive longer than humans without water, but not by much, and losing her animals would mean certain death in this barren country. The weight of her pregnancy made every mile more challenging than the last. At 6 months, her belly had grown large enough to make climbing onto the wagon seat an awkward process, and the constant jostling of the rough trail left her back aching and her legs cramped. She'd fashioned a cushion from one of her blankets, but nothing could completely ease the discomfort of hour after hour on the hard wooden bench. More troubling were the changes she felt in her body as the desert heat intensified. The baby, usually active during the cooler morning hours, seemed to grow sluggish as the day progressed. Sarah found herself drinking more water than she'd planned, her body demanding fluids to cope with the pregnancy and the brutal environment. Each sip from her water barrel was a calculation between immediate need and future survival, a constant reminder that her margin for error grew smaller with every passing hour. On the second night, she'd camped beside a small spring marked on her map, grateful to refill her water containers and allow the horses to drink their fill. But as she prepared to sleep under the star-filled sky, the reality of her vulnerability had struck her with startling clarity. Every sound in the darkness, from the distant howl of coyotes to the rustle of small creatures in the brush, reminded her that she was a stranger in a world where weakness was quickly punished. She'd lain awake for hours, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly as if sensing her anxiety. The desert night was cold after the blazing heat of the day, and she'd pulled her blankets close while staring up at stars. So brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. In Copper Ridge, there had always been the comforting sounds of human habitation, the distant voices from the saloons, the bark of dogs, the reassuring presence of neighbors just a shout away. Here, the silence was so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. The third day brought new challenges as the trail began to climb into rougher country. The path narrowed, forcing Sarah to guide her wagon carefully between rocky outcroppings that could tear a wheel or snap an axle if she miscalculated. The horses struggled with the steeper grades, their breathing labored in the thin air and punishing heat. Several times, Sarah was forced to dismount and walk alongside the wagon to reduce the load, her swollen feet aching in boots that had grown too tight during the long days of travel. It was during one of these walking periods that she first heard the sound that would change everything. At first, she thought it might be the wind echoing through the canyon walls, a low moan that seemed to drift from somewhere ahead. But as she paused to listen more carefully, she realized the sound had a distinctly human quality, a wordless cry that spoke of pain and desperation. Sarah's first instinct was caution. Mary Lou's warnings about trusting strangers in the desert echoed in her memory, along with stories of bandits and outlaws who preyed on isolated travelers. But as the sound came again, weaker this time and filled with such obvious suffering, her natural compassion overrode her fear. Someone was in trouble, and despite her own precarious situation, she couldn't simply continue on her way without investigating. She guided her wagon toward the source of the sound, following a faint side trail that led into a narrow arroyo carved by centuries of flash floods. The rocky walls rose on either side, creating a pocket of shade that offered blessed relief from the direct sunlight. It was here, slumped against a boulder in the deepest part of the shadows, that she found him. The man was clearly a cowboy, his clothing and gear marking him as someone who made his living working cattle across the vast ranges of the territory. His hat lay beside him in the dust, revealing hair bleached nearly white by years of sun exposure. His face was burned dark bronze, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent squinting against desert glare. But now those eyes were closed, and his breathing was so shallow that for a moment, Sarah feared she'd arrived too late. His clothes were travel-stained and torn, suggesting he'd been wandering the desert for some time. A leather holster hung empty at his hip, the gun probably lost when whatever disaster had stranded him in this desolate place. Most telling of all, his lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin showing the telltale signs of severe dehydration that Sarah had learned to recognize during her years in mining country. As she approached cautiously, the man's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. His voice, when he tried to speak, was nothing more than a raspy whisper that barely carried across the few feet between them. Water, he managed to croak, the single word containing all the desperate hope of a man who'd given up expecting rescue. Sarah's mind raced as she assessed the situation. Every drop of water in her wagon was precious, calculated to last her exactly long enough to reach the next reliable source according to her carefully planned route. Sharing her supply with a stranger could mean the difference between reaching California safely and dying somewhere in the desert waste. But looking at this man's condition, she knew he had perhaps hours left to live without immediate help. The baby kicked strongly at that moment, as if reminding her that she carried more than just her own life in her hands. The decision should have been simple, the logical choice clear. She had responsibilities that went beyond helping a stranger, no matter how dire his circumstances. Instead, Sarah found herself climbing down from the wagon and retrieving one of her water containers. The man's eyes tracked her movements with the desperate intensity of someone watching their last hope take physical form. When she knelt beside him and lifted the container to his lips, He drank with the desperate greed of someone who'd been staring death in the face. Slowly, she cautioned, remembering Doc Henderson's warnings about giving too much water too quickly to someone suffering from severe dehydration. Too much at once will make you sick. The cowboy nodded weakly, forcing himself to take smaller sips despite every instinct screaming at him to drain the container. As the life-giving liquid worked its way through his system, some color began to return to his face, and his breathing grew stronger. "Name's Jack," he whispered when he'd had enough water to speak clearly. "Jack Reynolds. Been wandering out here for lost track of how many days." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, settling back on her heels while keeping the water container within reach. "What happened to you?" Jack's story emerged in halting fragments as his strength gradually returned. He'd been riding with a small crew, driving cattle from a ranch in New Mexico to buyers in California, following one of the established routes that skirted the worst of the desert country. But their guide had proven unreliable, leading them into increasingly difficult terrain as he tried to find shortcuts that would shave days off the journey. 3 nights ago, Jack's horse had spooked during a lightning storm, throwing him hard against a rocky outcropping before disappearing into the darkness with most of his supplies. He'd managed to follow the cattle trail for a while, hoping to catch up with his companions, but the combination of a possible concussion and the disorienting effects of the desert heat had led him further and further astray. "Stupid of me," he admitted, his voice growing stronger with each sip of water. "Should have stayed put and waited for them to come back for me. But my head wasn't working right, and I kept thinking I could see their dust on the horizon." Sarah studied his face as he spoke, noting the intelligent eyes and the way he seemed genuinely grateful for her help rather than demanding or entitled. There was something about his manner that reminded her of Thomas, a quality of quiet strength tempered by gentleness that had drawn her to her late husband in the first place. "Your crew will be looking for you," she said, though she suspected they both knew the truth. In this vast country, a man who wandered off the main trail might never be found, and cattle drives operated on tight schedules that left little room for extended search parties. Jack shook his head slowly. "They've got deadlines to meet and cattle to deliver. Can't afford to spend days hunting for one missing hand, even if they knew which direction to look." The practical reality of his situation hung between them like a physical presence. Jack was still too weak to travel on foot, and without a horse, he had no way to cover the distances necessary to reach safety. Sarah's wagon offered the only possibility of survival, but taking him with her would strain her already limited resources to the breaking point. As if reading her thoughts, Jack struggled to sit up straighter against the boulder that had been supporting him. "I don't expect charity," he said carefully. "I've got some money, and I know this country well enough to earn my keep. If you're heading west, I could guide you through the worst of the desert. Know where the water holes are, which trails to avoid when the weather turns bad." Sarah felt the baby move again, a gentle reminder of the new life depending on her. Decisions. The logical choice was still clear. Taking Jack with her increased the risks, consumed more of her precious supplies, and complicated a journey that was already dangerous enough for a pregnant woman traveling alone. But as she looked at this man who'd been hours away from death, she found herself thinking about the random cruelties that had shaped both their lives. Thomas had died because a mine shaft collapsed at the wrong moment, victim of forces beyond anyone's control. Jack had nearly died because a horse spooked during a storm, another arbitrary twist of fate that could have happened to anyone. They were both refugees from circumstances they hadn't chosen, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to test their will to live. "I'm heading to California," she said finally. "My sister has a ranch near San Francisco. It's not going to be an easy trip, especially with—" She gestured toward her obvious pregnancy, the words trailing off as she realized how much she was revealing to a man she'd known for less than an hour. Jack's eyes followed her gesture, and she saw understanding dawn in his weathered features. The dangers that faced a pregnant woman crossing the desert alone were obvious to anyone who knew the country. And the fact that she'd undertaken such a journey spoke to either desperate courage or desperate foolishness. "Babies due when?" he asked gently, his tone suggesting genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. 3 months, according to Doc Henderson. Maybe less if the travel and heat bring it on early. Jack nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting to survey the harsh landscape surrounding them. "It's a hard journey for someone in your condition. A lot of things can go wrong between here and California." Sarah felt a flutter of fear at his words, but also a strange sense of relief at finally having someone acknowledge the reality of her situation. For days she'd been carrying the weight of her fears alone, trying to project confidence while privately terrifying herself with all the ways her journey could end in disaster. "I know it's dangerous," she admitted, "but staying in Copper Ridge wasn't really an option. Not with my husband dead and no way to support myself and a baby in a mining town." Something shifted in Jack's expression at the mention of her husband's death, a softening that suggested he understood the kind of loss that could drive someone to risk everything for the chance of a better life. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert that had nearly claimed his life. "I could get you there safely," he said finally. "Know the country between here and the coast, worked these ranges for years. Wouldn't be easy, but I could get you through." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Sarah knew she needed help, that her chances of reaching California alive would improve dramatically with an experienced guide. But accepting assistance from a man she'd just met, a stranger who would witness her vulnerability and depend on her resources, meant abandoning the fierce independence she'd cultivated since Thomas's death. Jack seemed to sense her hesitation. "I'm not asking for anything improper," he said quietly. "Just passage to somewhere I can find work and a horse. Once we reach civilized country, we go our separate ways." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. But all she saw was a man who understood that survival sometimes required uncomfortable alliances, that the desert didn't care about social conventions or the proper distance between strangers. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Sarah made her decision. "We'll need to be careful with the water," she said, climbing to her feet and brushing dust from her skirts. "And you'll have to walk when the trail gets rough. The horses are already carrying as much weight as they can handle." Jack's relief was visible, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of professional competence. "Won't be any trouble. Been walking across this country since before you were born, most likely." As they worked together to get Jack into the wagon, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected traveling companion with new interest. Despite his obvious exhaustion and dehydration, he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to physical hardship. His hands, she noticed, were calloused from years of rope work and hard riding, but his touch was gentle when he helped steady her as she climbed back onto the wagon seat. "How long since you've eaten?" she asked as they prepared to continue the journey. Jack considered the question. "Real food? 3, maybe 4 days. Had some jerky and hardtack when I first got thrown, but that's long gone." Sarah reached into her supplies and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were strips of dried beef and a few pieces of hardtack that Mary Lou had pressed on her before leaving Copper Ridge. She handed half to Jack, keeping the rest for herself and trying not to think about how quickly her food stores were disappearing. As they resumed their westward journey, the dynamic in Sarah's small world shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. Having another person to talk to made the endless hours of travel pass more quickly, and Jack's knowledge of the terrain ahead helped ease some of her anxiety about the unknown challenges that lay before them. But she was also acutely aware of how much her situation had changed. She was no longer a woman traveling alone, making decisions based solely on her own needs and capabilities. She was now part of a partnership, dependent on a man she barely knew while he depended on her resources for survival. The delicate balance of trust and self-reliance that would define their relationship was only beginning to take shape as they headed deeper into the unforgiving heart of the desert. The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah's wagon rolled across a stretch of hard-pan desert where nothing grew except scattered clumps of prickly pear cactus. Jack walked alongside the horses now, his strength gradually returning. With each mile they covered together, the arrangement worked better than Sarah had expected. His presence seemed to calm Belle and Daisy, who responded to his quiet voice and steady hands when the trail grew treacherous. Their first real test came when they reached Serpent's Pass, a narrow corridor between towering red rock formations that Jack warned could become a death trap if flash floods swept down from the distant mountains. The sky remained clear, but dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon, and Jack studied them with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read desert weather the hard way. "We need to move fast through here," he told Sarah, checking the harness connections one more time. Those clouds could dump rain 50 miles away and still send a wall of water through this canyon. Seen it happen before, and it's not something you want to get caught in. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken as she guided the wagon into the narrow passage. The walls rose high on either side, carved smooth by countless floods over the centuries. The sound of their wheels and the horses' hooves echoed strangely in the confined space, creating an eerie symphony that made her skin crawl. Jack maintained his position near the lead horse, ready to help guide them through the tightest sections, where one wrong move could scrape the wagon against the unforgiving stone. Halfway through the pass, they encountered their first serious obstacle. A recent rockslide had partially blocked the trail, leaving barely enough room for a wagon to squeeze through. Jack studied the situation carefully, walking back and forth to examine the angles and clearances they'd need to navigate safely. "It's going to be tight," he said finally. "We'll need to unhitch one of the horses and guide them through separately, then maneuver the wagon by hand." The process took nearly 2 hours of careful work. Sarah found herself amazed by Jack's patience and skill as he coaxed first Belle, then Daisy through the narrow gap between fallen boulders. His voice remained calm and reassuring even when Daisy balked at the confined space, her eyes rolling white with fear. When it came time to move the wagon, Jack positioned himself at the front while Sarah guided from behind, both of them straining against the weight as they inched through the opening. By the time they emerged from Serpent's Pass, the storm clouds had moved closer, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Jack urged them to greater speed, his eyes constantly scanning the high walls around them for signs of water flow. When they finally reached higher ground beyond the canyon mouth, Sarah felt her shoulders sag with relief. "Good work back there," Jack said as they paused to rest and reattach the horses to the wagon. Not many folks could have kept their nerve in that tight spot. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride at his words. She was discovering reserves of strength and capability that she'd never known she possessed. The sheltered life she'd lived in St. Louis, and even her relatively comfortable existence in Copper Ridge, had given her little opportunity to test herself against real adversity. Out here in the desert, with life and death decisions facing her daily, she was becoming someone she barely recognized. The storm that followed tested both of them in different ways. What started as scattered raindrops quickly intensified into a downpour that turned the desert floor into a treacherous maze of slippery rocks and sudden streams. Jack found them shelter in a shallow cave that offered protection from the worst of the weather, but the space was cramped and uncomfortable. Huddled together in the dim confines of their temporary refuge, Sarah became acutely aware of the impropriety of her situation. Here she was, a pregnant widow sharing close quarters with a man she'd known for less than a week, dependent on his protection and guidance in ways that would have scandalized the proper ladies of St. Louis. But the desert had its own rules, and survival took precedence over social conventions. Jack seemed to understand her discomfort without needing explanation. He positioned himself near the cave entrance, maintaining a respectful distance while still being close enough to keep watch for dangers. When Sarah shivered in her damp clothes, he offered his leather vest without making her ask, then turned away to give her privacy while she wrapped it around her shoulders. "Tell me about your sister's ranch," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the sound of rain drumming against the rocks outside. "What's it like in California?" Sarah found herself grateful for the distraction of conversation. She described Emma's letters, filled with accounts of green pastures and mild weather, of fruit trees that grew wild along the streams, and cattle that could graze year-round without the constant threat of drought or freeze. It sounded like paradise, compared to the harsh country they were crossing, though Sarah wondered if her sister's descriptions might be colored by the natural tendency to emphasize the positive in letters to family. "Sounds like good country," Jack agreed. "Worked some of those coastal ranges years back, before I drifted east into New Mexico. The grass grows thick as carpet, and the water runs clear and cold, even in summer. A man could build something lasting in country like that." There was something wistful in his voice that made Sarah study his profile in the dim light. She realized how little she actually knew about this man who was risking his own survival to help her reach safety. His clothes and gear marked him as an experienced cowhand, but she sensed there was more to his story than simple wage work on other men's ranches. "Have you ever thought about settling down?" she asked carefully. "Finding a place of your own instead of always moving from job to job?" Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he hadn't heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of dreams deferred and opportunities missed. "Used to think about it all the time," he admitted. "Had a chance once, down in Texas. Found a piece of land that called to me, good grass and water, close enough to markets to make a living. Even had a woman who said she'd wait while I saved up the money to buy it proper. What happened? Drought hit 3 years running. Cattle died, grass turned to dust, and the bank started calling in loans. By the time it was over, the land was gone and so was she. Married a shopkeeper in town who could offer her a roof that wouldn't blow away in the next windstorm." Sarah heard the old pain in his voice and found herself wanting to offer comfort, though she wasn't sure what words could ease that kind of loss. She understood now why Jack had been willing to risk everything on a cattle drive through dangerous country. When a man had already lost what mattered most to him, the distinction between calculated risk and reckless desperation became meaningless. The rain continued through the night, forcing them to remain in their cramped shelter long after both would have preferred to resume traveling. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking often to check on the baby's movements and reassure herself that the stress of their journey wasn't affecting the child. Jack seemed to require little sleep, maintaining his vigilant watch and occasionally stepping outside to check on the horses, despite the continuing downpour. Dawn brought clear skies and the discovery that their forced delay had actually saved their lives. The wash they would have been crossing when the storm hit was now a raging torrent 20 feet deep, carrying debris and boulders with terrifying power. They stood on the bank watching the destruction, both sobered by how close they'd come to disaster. "How long before it's safe to cross?" Sarah asked, eyeing the muddy water with deep apprehension. "Day, maybe 2, Jack replied. "Desert floods are fierce but quick. Once the water from the mountains finishes running off, this will go back to being a dry creek bed." The delay chafed at Sarah's nerves. Every day spent in the desert increased the risks to both herself and her unborn child, and their supplies were dwindling faster than she'd calculated when planning the journey. But Jack's knowledge of desert conditions had already saved them. Once, and she'd learned to trust his judgment about when to push forward and when to wait. They used the forced rest to reorganize their remaining supplies and make repairs to equipment damaged by the rough travel. Sarah was shocked to discover how much their shared meals had depleted her food stores. What she'd calculated would last her to California would now run out long before they reached safety if they continued eating at their current rate. Jack noticed her concern as she inventoried their remaining provisions. "We can stretch it," he said quietly. "I've gone longer on less. And there are things to eat out here if you know where to look." Over the next few hours, he proved his point by finding edible cactus fruits and identifying plants that could supplement their dwindling supplies. Sarah watched with fascination as he demonstrated how to remove the spines from prickly pear pads and prepare them for eating, or how to locate the hidden water stores in barrel cacti during emergencies. "The desert's not as empty as it looks," he explained as they worked together to gather enough plant food to extend their supplies by several days. "Just takes knowing what to look for and how to use it safely." When the floodwater finally receded, enough for them to continue their journey, they found the landscape transformed. The violent flow had carved new channels in the earth and deposited sand and debris in unexpected places. Their original trail was gone, forcing Jack to find an alternate route that added miles to their journey but kept them on solid ground. The detour led them through a section of desert that Jack admitted he'd never crossed before, though he recognized enough landmarks to maintain their general westward direction. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, with steep-sided arroyos and fields of loose rock that made progress slow and treacherous. It was in this unfamiliar country that they faced their most serious crisis yet. Sarah was walking beside the wagon to rest her aching back when her foot caught in a hidden crevice between rocks, sending her tumbling hard to the ground. She cried out as pain shot through her ankle, and when she tried to stand, her leg buckled. Beneath her, Jack was at her side instantly, his hands gentle but skilled as he examined her injury. His face was grim as he felt the swelling that was already beginning around her ankle joint. "It's not broken," he said finally, "but it's badly twisted. You won't be walking on it for several days at least." The implications of her injury hit Sarah like a physical blow. They were still days away from the nearest settlement, traveling through country where every mile required careful navigation. If she couldn't walk when the terrain became too rough for the wagon, their progress would slow to a crawl, stretching their already strained supplies beyond the breaking point. "I can manage," she said through gritted teeth, struggling to rise. Despite the protests from her injured ankle, "I have to manage." Jack caught her arms as she swayed, his grip firm but gentle. "No shame in needing help," he said quietly. "That's what partners do for each other." The word partners hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither had explicitly acknowledged before. They were no longer simply strangers sharing resources for mutual benefit. Somewhere in the dangers they'd faced together, they'd become something more, bound by trust and shared dependence in ways that went beyond mere convenience. As Jack helped her back onto the wagon seat and fashioned a makeshift support for her injured foot, Sarah found herself looking at him with new eyes. This man who'd been dying of thirst when she found him had become her protector and guide, someone whose quiet strength she'd come to depend on more than she cared to admit. The realization both comforted and frightened her. She'd been determined to remain independent, to prove she could survive on her own strength and determination. But the desert was teaching her that independence was sometimes just another word for foolish pride, and that accepting help didn't diminish her worth as a person. As they continued westward with Sarah's ankle throbbing with each bump and jolt of the wagon, both travelers were learning lessons about trust and survival that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to depend on another person. Desert had brought them together through desperation, but it was forging them into something stronger through shared adversity. The relentless sun climbed higher each day as they pushed deeper into the heart of the desert, and Sarah began to understand why this stretch of country was called the Devil's Backbone. The landscape had turned alien and hostile, with jagged rock formations jutting from the earth like the vertebrae of some massive buried creature. The heat was no longer just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, creating a shimmering wall of superheated air that made breathing feel like swallowing fire. Sarah's injured ankle had healed enough for her to walk short distances, but the constant jolting of the wagon over increasingly rough terrain left her entire body aching. More concerning was the way the baby had begun moving differently, with sharp, agitated kicks that came at odd hours and seemed to increase during the hottest parts of the day. She tried to hide her growing anxiety from Jack, but she caught him watching her with quiet concern whenever he thought she wasn't looking. Their water situation had become critical, despite Jack's careful rationing and his knowledge of hidden springs. They were consuming their precious supply faster than they could replenish it. The barrel cactus and occasional seepage springs he'd found provided enough to keep them alive, but barely enough to account for the extra demands of pregnancy and the brutal heat that seemed to leach moisture from their bodies with every breath. Jack had grown increasingly protective as Sarah's condition became more precarious. He insisted on walking more often to reduce the weight on the horses, and she noticed he'd begun giving her larger portions of their dwindling food while claiming he wasn't hungry. When she protested, he'd simply smile and change the subject. But she could see the way his clothes had begun to hang loose on his frame. The morning everything changed started like any other. They'd camped in the shadow of a massive boulder that provided some relief from the night's chill, and Jack was checking their supplies while Sarah tried to coax their small cooking fire to life with increasingly scarce fuel. The baby had been restless all night, keeping her awake with constant movement that felt different from the gentle stirring she'd grown accustomed to. How much further to the next water? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jack studied the horizon with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read the desert's subtle signs. 2 days, maybe 3 if we stick to the safer route. There's a spring marked on my mental map at Coyote Wells, but it's been dry before during bad years. Sarah felt her heart sink. They had perhaps a day and a half of water remaining, and that was if they rationed it so strictly that they'd be weak from dehydration by the time they reached their destination. If the spring at Coyote Wells was dry, they'd be facing a choice between turning back into country they'd already crossed or pushing forward into completely unknown territory with no guarantee of finding water. As they prepared to break camp, Sarah stood up too quickly and felt the world tilt around her. Jack caught her arm as she swayed, his face immediately creased with worry. "Just stood up too fast," she said quickly, trying to reassure him even as spots danced in her vision. "I'm fine." But they both knew she wasn't fine. The combination of heat, dehydration, and the physical demands of pregnancy was taking a toll that couldn't be ignored much longer. Jack helped her onto the wagon seat with extra care, and she noticed the way his hands lingered on her arms, as if he was afraid she might collapse. The trail that day led them through a maze of narrow canyons, where the walls rose so high that the sun disappeared for hours at a time. The sudden shifts between blazing heat and cool shadow were disorienting, and Sarah found herself struggling to maintain her sense of direction. Jack walked ahead of the horses now, testing the footing and calling out warnings about loose rocks or sudden drops. It was in one of these shadowy passages that they encountered the most frightening moment of their entire journey. Sarah was dozing on the wagon seat, lulled by the rhythmic creaking of the wheels, when Jack's sharp whistle brought her instantly awake. He was standing frozen about 20 feet ahead, his hand raised in a clear signal for her to stop the wagon immediately. Coiled on a sun-warmed rock directly in their path was the largest rattlesnake Sarah had ever seen. The serpent was easily 6 feet long and thick as a man's arm, its diamond-patterned skin gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Its tail was raised and vibrating with a sound like dried beans in a gourd. a warning that it was prepared to strike anything that came within. "Range. Don't move," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air of the canyon. "And keep the horses calm. We need to back up slow and find another way around." But as Sarah reached for the reins, Belle chose that moment to catch sight of the snake. The mare's nostrils flared with terror, and before Sarah could react, both horses reared and lunged sideways, trying to escape the perceived threat. The wagon lurched violently, and Sarah felt herself sliding toward the edge of the seat as her injured ankle failed to provide the stability she needed to maintain her balance. Jack moved faster than she would have thought possible. Even as the rattlesnake struck at the commotion, its fangs scraping harmlessly against the wooden side of the wagon, he was vaulting over rocks to reach the panicked horses. His hands found their bridles, and his voice began the steady, calming murmur that had worked so effectively during their previous crises. "Easy there, easy," he crooned, his tone somehow penetrating the horses' panic. "Nothing's going to hurt you. We're just going to back up nice and slow." It took nearly half an hour to calm the animals enough to maneuver the wagon backward to a safe distance. The rattlesnake, apparently satisfied that the threat had been neutralized, eventually uncoiled and slithered away into the rocks. But the incident left Sarah shaken in ways that went beyond the immediate danger. "I could have been killed," she whispered as Jack helped her down from the wagon to rest on solid ground. "The baby could have been killed." Jack knelt beside her, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her steady her breathing. "But you weren't," he said firmly. "You kept your head, and we got through it. That's what matters." But Sarah could see in his eyes that the near miss had affected him as deeply as it had her. The protective instinct she'd noticed growing stronger over the past weeks had crystallized into something more intense, a fierce determination to see her safely to California that went far beyond their original arrangement. That evening, as they made camp in a wider section of the canyon, Sarah found herself watching Jack with new awareness. He moved through the familiar routines of caring for the horses and securing their camp with the efficiency of long practice. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. "You don't have to carry all the responsibility," she said quietly as he checked their water supply for what seemed like the 100th time that day. Jack looked up from the barrel he'd been examining, his expression carefully neutral. "Don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Sarah shifted on her blanket, trying to find a position that eased the constant ache in her back. "You're wearing yourself out trying to protect me from everything this desert can throw at us. But some things are beyond anyone's control." For a moment, Jack's careful composure cracked, revealing the depth of worry he'd been hiding. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Not in your condition, not crossing country this dangerous. If something happens to you or the baby because I made the wrong choice about water or trail." "Stop." Sarah's voice was firm enough to cut through his self-recrimination. "I was the one who chose to cross this desert. You didn't force me into anything. You've done nothing but help me from the moment I found you dying of thirst." Jack was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening canyon walls as if they held answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of confessions he'd never intended to make. "Had a wife once," he said quietly. "Down in Texas, before the drought took everything. She was carrying our first child when the fever came through. Lost them both in the same week, and there wasn't a damned thing I could do to save either one of them." Sarah felt her heart constrict with sympathy for the pain in his voice. She began to understand the fierce protectiveness he'd shown, the way he'd pushed himself to exhaustion ensuring her safety. He wasn't just guiding a stranger to California. He was fighting demons from his own past, trying to rewrite a tragedy that had shaped every day of his life since. "I'm not her," Sarah said gently. And you're not the same man who couldn't save them. Look at everything you've done to get us this far. Without you, I'd never have made it past that first water hole." Jack turned to look at her, and in the flickering light of their small fire, Sarah could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "Can't lose you too," he whispered. "Don't think I could survive that again." The raw honesty of his admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Sarah found herself reaching for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "You won't lose me," she said, though they both knew she was making a promise that might be beyond her power to keep. "We're going to get through this together." The next morning brought a crisis that tested every ounce of determination they possessed. Sarah woke to cramping pains in her abdomen that were unlike anything she'd experienced during her pregnancy. At first, she tried to dismiss them as the result of sleeping on hard ground and the constant stress of travel. But as they prepared to break camp, the pains intensified into something that made her gasp and double over. Jack was at her side. Instantly, his face pale with alarm. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Sarah managed between waves of pain. "Something's not right with the baby." Jack's training and caring for injured cattle and horses had given him some knowledge of emergency birthing, but he was terrifyingly aware of how different and dangerous human complications could be. The cramping could be early labor, brought on by the stress and dehydration of their journey, or it could be something worse that threatened both mother and child. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, already beginning to break down their camp with frantic efficiency. "The nearest doctor is in California," Sarah pointed out, trying to breathe through another wave of cramping. "That's still days away, even if we push hard." Jack's jaw was set with grim determination as he helped her onto the wagon seat. "Then we push hard." What followed was the most grueling day of travel either of them had ever endured. Jack drove the horses with a relentless urgency that bordered on reckless, following trails that were barely more than animal paths in his desperate attempt to shave hours off their journey time. Sarah clung to the wagon seat as they bounced and lurched over terrain that would have been challenging at a careful pace, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through her cramping abdomen. By midday, it became clear that the horses couldn't maintain the punishing pace much longer. Both mares were lathered with sweat and breathing hard, their heads hanging with exhaustion. Jack was forced to stop in whatever shade he could find and allow them to rest, though every minute of delay chafed against his urgent need to get Sarah to medical help. "This isn't working," Sarah said as she watched him pace restlessly beside the exhausted animals. "We're going to kill the horses, and then we'll be stranded out here with no way to reach help at all." Jack knew she was right, but accepting the logic of their situation meant acknowledging that they were trapped in the desert, with a medical emergency they had no way to handle. The nearest settlement was still at least 2 days away at a sustainable pace, and Sarah's condition was deteriorating with each passing hour. It was then that Jack made a decision that revealed the true depth of his feelings for the woman he'd sworn to protect. Leaving Sarah with the wagon and most of their remaining water, he saddled Belle and prepared to ride ahead alone to bring back help. "You can't," Sarah protested, struggling to rise from her resting place despite the ongoing cramps. "It's too dangerous to travel alone, and I can't manage the wagon by myself." "You won't have to manage anything," Jack replied, checking the rifle he was taking with him. "Just stay here and conserve your strength. I'll be back with the doctor within 2 days, I promise." Sarah grabbed his arm as he prepared to mount the horse. "What if you don't make it? What if your horse goes lame or you get lost or run into trouble? I'll die out here alone, and so will the baby." Jack knelt beside her, taking her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "That's not going to happen. I've crossed worse country than this, and I've got more reason to make it through than I've ever had before." The intensity in his eyes told Sarah that something fundamental had changed between them during their weeks of shared struggle. This wasn't just about honoring a promise to help a stranger reach safety. Somewhere in the crucible of desert survival, they'd become something more precious to each other than either had expected. "I love you," Jack said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Didn't plan on it, didn't want it to happen, but there it is. And I'm not going to let you die if there's anything in my power to prevent it." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the full implications of his confession washed over her. She'd been so focused on reaching California and building a new life for her child that she hadn't recognized the deeper connection growing between them. But now, facing the possibility of losing him, she understood that her heart had been healing in ways she'd thought impossible. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "Come back to me, Jack Reynolds. Don't you dare leave me alone in this world." Jack pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss that felt like both a blessing and a vow. Then he was mounting Belle and spurring her into the shimmering heat of the desert, racing against time and distance to save the woman who'd become his reason for living. The hours that followed Jack's departure stretched like an eternity for Sarah. Alone with just Daisy for company, she found herself facing fears she'd tried to keep buried since leaving Copper Ridge. The cramping in her abdomen had eased somewhat, but the underlying weakness and occasional sharp pains reminded her that her body was being pushed beyond its limits. She rationed her water with the discipline Jack had taught her, but every sip was a calculated gamble between immediate need and the possibility that help might not arrive in time. As the sun reached its merciless peak, Sarah sought what shelter she could find in the shadow of a large boulder. The desert around her seemed to pulse with heat waves that made the horizon dance like a mirage. She tried to occupy her mind by cataloging the lessons Jack had taught her about desert survival, testing herself on which plants were safe to eat and how to recognize the signs of flash flood danger. But her thoughts kept returning to the man who'd ridden into the blazing waste with nothing but determination and a half-lame horse. The second night alone was the longest of Sarah's life. Every sound in the darkness, from the distant howl of coyotes to the scrabble of small creatures in the rocks, made her start and reach for the rifle Jack had left with her. She'd never fired a gun in anger, and the weight of the weapon felt foreign in her hands. But its presence provided a small measure of comfort in the vast emptiness that surrounded her temporary camp. Dreams came fitfully when exhaustion finally overcame her anxiety. She found herself reliving moments from their journey together, seeing with new clarity how gradually their partnership had deepened into something neither had expected. There was the night Jack had shared his coat when the desert cold cut through her thin blankets. The morning he'd gathered extra cactus fruit when he noticed she was growing thin. The countless small acts of consideration that had built trust between two people who'd started as strangers bound only by necessity. When dawn broke on the third day, Sarah felt a new kind of determination settling in her chest. Whether Jack returned with help or not, she would not simply wait passively for rescue or death. She began organizing their remaining supplies and checking the harness on Daisy, preparing for the possibility that she might need to continue the journey alone. The thought terrified her, but she'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. It was mid-morning when she first saw the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. At first, she dismissed it as another heat mirage, but as the minutes passed, the cloud grew larger and more distinct. Someone was coming, traveling fast across the desert floor. Sarah's heart hammered as she strained her eyes to make out details, praying that the approaching riders weren't outlaws or hostile Indians who might see a lone woman as easy prey. The first figure to resolve out of the shimmering heat was unmistakably Jack, sitting tall in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion. Behind him rode two other men, one of whom appeared to be leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief, but she forced herself to remain standing as the rescue party approached her makeshift camp. Jack was off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. His arms went around her with fierce protectiveness, and she could feel the tremor in his hands as he held her close. "Thank God," he whispered against her hair. "I wasn't sure I'd made it in time." The 2 men with him proved to be Dr. William Hartley, a frontier physician who'd been visiting the settlement of Mesa Springs when Jack arrived, and Tom Bradley, a local rancher who'd volunteered to guide them back across the desert. Dr. Hartley was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who carried himself with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to handling medical emergencies under difficult conditions. "Let's have a look at you, young lady," he said gently, setting down his medical bag and beginning his examination with practiced efficiency. His questions were thorough but not intrusive, and his hands were surprisingly gentle as he checked her vital signs and listened to the baby's heartbeat with a primitive stethoscope. "The cramping you experienced was likely brought on by dehydration and stress," he explained after completing his examination. "The baby seems to be weathering the ordeal better than might be expected, but you need proper rest, nutrition, and medical supervision for the remainder of your pregnancy." Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it left her lightheaded. The fears that had haunted her for days began to recede as Dr. Hartley outlined a treatment plan that would see her safely through the remaining weeks of pregnancy. "Mesa Springs has a proper medical facility," Tom Bradley added, his weathered face kind beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "My wife Martha runs a boarding house there, and she's helped bring half the babies in the territory into the world. You'd be welcome to stay with us until you're strong enough to continue your journey." The offer of sanctuary felt almost too good to be true after the weeks of uncertainty and danger. But as Sarah looked at the faces surrounding her, she saw only genuine concern and the kind of frontier hospitality that could mean the difference between life and death in this harsh country. The journey to Mesa Springs took 2 days, but it was unlike any travel Sarah had experienced since leaving Copper Ridge, with Dr. Hartley monitoring her condition and the stress of navigation removed from her shoulders. She found herself able to rest properly for the first time in weeks. Jack rode beside the wagon, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. Mesa Springs proved to be a genuine oasis in the desert, built around a series of natural springs that provided abundant fresh water for both the settlement and travelers passing through. The town was larger than Copper Ridge, with tree-lined streets and substantial buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Martha Bradley's boarding house was a 2-story structure with wide porches and comfortable rooms that seemed luxurious after weeks of camping under the stars. Martha herself was a motherly woman in her 40s who took one look at Sarah's condition and immediately began fussing over her with the kind of care Sarah hadn't experienced since leaving St. Louis. Within hours, she was installed in a comfortable room with clean sheets, proper meals, and the promise of Dr. Hartley's continued supervision. But the physical comfort, welcome as it was, couldn't address the larger questions that had arisen during their desert ordeal. Sarah and Jack had declared their love for each other in a moment of crisis, but now they had to decide what that meant for their future. They were both damaged by loss, both carrying the scars of lives that hadn't turned out as planned. The intensity of their desert experience had forged a bond between them, but whether that bond could survive in the normal world remained to be seen. Jack seemed to sense her uncertainty without needing explanation. On their 3rd evening in Mesa Springs, as Sarah sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, he settled into the chair beside her with the careful movements of a man choosing his words. Deliberately. "Been thinking about what comes next," he said quietly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Know you had plans to reach your sister in California, and I don't want to complicate things for you." Sarah felt her heart clench at the careful distance in his voice. After everything they'd shared, after the love they'd confessed in their darkest moment, Was he preparing to walk away because he thought it was what she wanted? What would you want to happen? She asked carefully, if the choice was entirely yours? Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert that had brought them together. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of dreams he'd thought lost forever. I'd want to build something lasting, he admitted. Find a piece of land where we could raise your baby and maybe others. Create the kind of life I thought was impossible after I lost everything in Texas. Sarah reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the same natural gesture that had marked the turning point in their relationship. That's what I want too, she said simply. Not the life I planned, but the life I discovered I needed. The conversation that followed extended long into the evening, covering practical concerns and deeper questions of trust and commitment. They talked about Sarah's sister in California, who would understand if her plans changed, and about the opportunities available to a couple willing to work hard in the growing settlements of the Arizona territory. Tom Bradley had mentioned land available for homesteading not far from Mesa Springs, good grazing country with reliable water that could support both cattle and farming. Dr. Hartley had advised that Sarah should remain in Mesa Springs until after the baby was born, both for her health and the child's safety. The timing would allow Jack to establish himself in the area, perhaps working for Tom Bradley while they saved money to purchase their own land. It wasn't the quick resolution either had envisioned, but it offered the promise of building something solid and lasting. The weeks that followed settled into a routine that felt almost like normal life after the intensity of their desert journey. Sarah regained her strength under Martha Bradley's care, while Jack found steady work with Tom's cattle operation. Evenings found them together on the boarding house porch, planning their future and marveling at how dramatically their lives had changed since that day. Sarah had found him dying of thirst in the desert. When Sarah's labor finally began on a crisp morning in late October, Jack paced the boarding house parlor like a caged wolf while Martha and Dr. Hartley attended to the birth upstairs. The hours of waiting were almost as agonizing as their worst moments in the desert, filled with the same desperate uncertainty about whether everything they'd fought would be lost to circumstances beyond their control. The baby's first cry, strong and indignant, was the most beautiful sound Jack had ever heard. When Dr. Hartley finally allowed him upstairs to meet his new family, he found Sarah exhausted but radiant, holding a perfect little girl with her mother's dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in the world with fearless curiosity. "She's beautiful," Jack whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "What should we call her?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held all the love and trust that had grown between them during their ordeal. "Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope." 6 months later, Jack Reynolds and Sarah Mitchell were married in a simple ceremony in Mesa Springs Small Church, with baby Hope sleeping peacefully in Martha Bradley's arms as they exchanged vows. The land they'd purchased together lay 20 miles west of town, good country with grass and water and room to grow. It wasn't the life either had originally planned, but it was built on a foundation of trust and mutual dependence that made it stronger than any dream they'd pursued alone. The little house Jack built for his family was modest but sturdy, designed to withstand the harsh weather that periodically swept across the territory. Sarah planted a garden beside the kitchen door, coaxing vegetables and flowers from soil that seemed too harsh to nurture such tender things. But like their relationship, the garden thrived with patient care and determined effort. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, she displayed the same fearless curiosity that had marked her parents' approach to building a life in challenging country. She explored every corner of their small ranch with the confident assumption that the world was a place of wonder rather than danger, a perspective that reminded Sarah daily of how much her own outlook had changed since leaving Copper Ridge. Neighbors were scarce in their part of the territory, but the few families who'd chosen to build lives in the area formed a tight-knit community bound by mutual dependence and shared challenges. When drought threatened their first year's crops, they worked together to dig deeper wells and share water resources. When illness struck one family, others provided care and labor until the crisis passed. It was frontier life at its best, hard but honest, with rewards that went beyond mere survival. Jack proved to be as skilled at ranching as he was at desert survival, building their cattle herd with the same patient determination he'd shown during their journey together. Sarah discovered talents she'd never suspected, becoming not just a capable ranch wife, but a respected voice in community decisions. When Mesa Springs needed a teacher for their growing school, she volunteered for the position, traveling to town twice a week to educate the settlement's children while Hope played with the other ranchers' wives. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and Hope was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Sarah and Jack would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the same desert that had tested them so severely. The harsh landscape looked different now, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a teacher that had shown them strengths they'd never known they possessed. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one evening, her hand resting on her belly where their second child was beginning to make its presence known. "Giving up the wandering life for this?" Jack considered the question seriously, as he did most things, his gaze sweeping across the land they'd claimed together. "Never," he said finally. "Found out there's something better than being free. To go anywhere, there's having a place worth staying for." Their story became part of the folklore of Mesa Springs, told and retold by neighbors who marveled at how two desperate people had found salvation in each other. But for Sarah and Jack, it wasn't a story but simply the foundation of the life they'd built together. One day at a time, one challenge at a time, with the same determination that had carried them across the desert. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, they would tell her about the journey that had brought them together, about the desert that had nearly claimed their lives, but had ultimately given them everything that mattered. They would teach her that love wasn't just a feeling but a choice, made new each day in countless small acts of loyalty and sacrifice. They would show her that strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it together, and that the most precious things in life were often discovered not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle. The desert had taught them that survival was more than just staying alive. It was about finding the courage to trust another person completely, to risk everything for the possibility of something better, and to build a life worthy of the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. In a land where so many dreams died under the relentless sun, they had discovered that some things could not only survive but flourish, growing stronger with each trial they weathered together. Their ranch became a stopping point for other travelers crossing the territory, a place where exhausted families could find food, water, and the encouragement that came from seeing others who had successfully made the transition from survival to prosperity. Sarah and Jack never turned away anyone in genuine need, understanding better than most how thin the line was between safety and disaster in frontier country. The love story that had begun with a desperate act of mercy beside a desert trail had grown into something larger than either of them had imagined possible. It was proof that even in the harshest places, even when hope seemed lost, human connection could create something beautiful and lasting. Their life together stood as testimony to the truth that the greatest adventures weren't about conquering new territories, but about discovering what it meant to truly belong to another person and to a place worth defending. In the end, the desert that had nearly destroyed them had given them everything they needed to build a life of purpose and meaning. It had stripped away everything superficial and revealed the bedrock of character that lay beneath. It had tested their courage, their determination, and their capacity for love. And in surviving those tests, they had become people worthy of the happiness they had found together. The morning Jack rode back into Sarah's life with Dr. Hartley brought more than just medical salvation. It brought the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine during their darkest hours in the desert. As the doctor examined Sarah and confirmed that both she and the baby would survive their ordeal, Jack found himself looking at this brave woman with eyes that saw beyond their immediate crisis to possibilities that stretched far beyond the horizon. Mesa Springs welcomed them with the kind of genuine hospitality that made frontier communities more than just collections of buildings scattered across harsh landscape. Martha Bradley's boarding house became Sarah's sanctuary, a place where she could rest and recover while contemplating the choices that lay ahead. The town itself was a testament to what determined people could accomplish when they refused to let the desert defeat their dreams. During the peaceful weeks of Sarah's recovery, she and Jack spent countless hours talking about everything they'd discovered about themselves and each other during their harrowing journey. The crisis had stripped away pretense and social expectations, revealing the core of who they really were beneath the roles they'd played in their previous lives. What they'd found was a compatibility that went deeper than attraction or convenience. A fundamental alignment of values and dreams that made their love feel both surprising and inevitable. The decision to stay in Arizona territory rather than continuing to California wasn't made lightly. Sarah wrote long letters to her sister Emma, explaining the circumstances that had changed her plans and the man who had become central to her future. Emma's response was characteristically generous, expressing joy at Sarah's happiness and extending an open invitation to visit whenever travel became feasible. The blessing of family, even from a distance, gave Sarah the final assurance she needed that she was making the right choice. Jack's proposal came not in a moment of high drama, but during one of their quiet evening conversations on Martha Bradley's porch. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as he spoke simply about wanting to build a life together, to create something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Sarah's acceptance was equally straightforward, an acknowledgement that they'd already committed to each other in ways that made formal engagement merely a public recognition of existing reality. The months that followed established a rhythm that felt surprisingly normal after the intensity of their desert ordeal. Jack worked with Tom Bradley's cattle operation, learning the specific challenges of ranching in Arizona territory while saving money for their own land. Sarah helped Martha with the boarding house, discovering that her city upbringing had given her skills that were valuable in frontier hospitality. The work was honest and satisfying, providing both the means to build their future and the community connections that would sustain them through the challenges ahead. When Sarah's labor began on a crisp October morning, Jack experienced terror, more complete than anything the desert had thrown at them. The hours of waiting while Martha and Dr. Hartley attended the birth felt endless, filled with the same desperate uncertainty that had characterized their worst moments of the journey. But when baby Hope finally arrived, healthy and strong, Jack understood that their ordeal had been leading to this moment of perfect completion. Their wedding 6 months later was a celebration that brought together everyone who'd supported them through their transition from desperate strangers to established members of the community. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted in Mesa Springs' small church with Hope sleeping peacefully in Martha Bradley's arms as they exchanged vows. The promises they made to each other were informed by the knowledge of what they'd already survived together, making their commitment feel both sacred and utterly practical. The land they purchased together lay in a valley where spring water created an oasis of green in the surrounding desert. It wasn't the richest country in the territory, but it was theirs, a place where they could build something lasting with their own hands and determination. The house Jack constructed was modest but solid, designed to withstand the harsh weather that periodically swept across the region while providing comfort and security for his growing family. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, she displayed the same fearless curiosity that had marked her parents' approach to building a life in challenging circumstances. She explored every corner of their small ranch with the confident assumption that the world was fundamentally safe and wonderful. A perspective that reminded Sarah daily of how much her own outlook had changed since leaving Copper Ridge as a frightened widow. Their second child, a son they named Thomas in honor of Sarah's first husband, arrived 2 years later during a spring that brought abundant rain and the promise of good grass for their growing cattle herd. Jack proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, teaching his children the skills they'd need to thrive in frontier life, while never forgetting the gentleness that made him different from many men shaped by harsh experience. The ranch became a stopping point for other travelers crossing the territory, a place where exhausted families could find food, water, and the encouragement that came from seeing others who had successfully made the transition from survival to prosperity. Sarah and Jack never turned away anyone in genuine need, understanding better than most how thin the line was between safety and disaster in frontier country. Years later, when their children were old enough to understand, they would tell the story of how their parents had met in the desert, how an act of mercy had grown into a love that sustained them through every challenge. They would teach their children that the greatest adventures weren't about conquering new territories, but about discovering what it meant to truly belong to another person and to a place worth defending. The desert that had nearly destroyed them had ultimately given them everything they needed to build a life of purpose and meaning. It had tested their courage, their determination, and their capacity for love, and in surviving those tests, they had become people worthy of the happiness they had found together. Their story became part of the folklore of Mesa Springs, proof that even in the harshest places, human connection could create something beautiful and lasting. In the end, Sarah and Jack's love story was more than just a tale of survival and romance. It was a testament to the transformative power of compassion, the strength that comes from facing adversity together, and the truth that sometimes the most precious things in life are discovered not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle. Their ranch stood as evidence that love, like the desert plants that bloomed after rare rains, could not only survive but flourish in the most unlikely places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.